Hello and welcome to this very special edition of NLF Imaginary Lines 2020. We're thoroughly excited to be here, and we hope you are too. In our events today, we're going to be speaking about a topic that is on a lot of people's minds. We're going to be speaking about diversity in children's books and the representation of different childhoods. Why is this important? Why do children need to see characters like themselves in the books that they read? Why is it essential that these characters have diction that is similar to what children hear in their daily lives? How do writers make these worlds authentic? We will be exploring a few of these questions and more in the course of our sessions today. At first, through a conversation that promises to be scintillating at the very least, followed by a book club that is sure to be enlightening. Before we introduce our speakers for today, we'd like to go over some housekeeping rules for the audience. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box right away. We will discuss questions around 40 minutes into the session. If you raise your virtual hand, we would not be able to attend to your question. Hence, we recommend that you use the Q&A box to share your questions with us. We will be putting up a few polls during the webinar in order to engage with you further and would love for you to participate in the same. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the first session. We have with us Emily Drabble, Head of Children's Book Promotion and Prizes at the Reading for Pleasure charity Book Trust. She heads up the team that runs the Children's Laureate in the UK, a position awarded once every 2 years to an eminent writer or illustrator of children's books to celebrate outstanding achievement in their field and to acknowledge their importance in creating the readers of tomorrow. The current Children's Laureate in the UK is Cressida Cowell, the creator of the popular How to Train Your Dragon series. Emily leads the Book Trust Represents Inclusion project and several prizes, including the Book Trust Lifetime Achievement Award. She also heads the team that publishes children's book reviews on the Book Trust website and other content and advice to help inspire all children to read for pleasure. Before Book Trust, Emily was a journalist with The Guardian, where she most recently edited the Guardian Children's Books website, which is where I first came across her work. Welcome, Emily. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Karthika. I'm so happy to be here.
Joining Emily is somebody else that we're very fond of. Sayoni Basu is one of India's best editors for books for children and young adults. In her own words, Sayoni says she has been an editor of books for children for more years than she can remember. She has worked with Penguin, Scholastic, and Amar Chitrakatha, and is the co-founder of Duckbill Books. Everybody who is anybody in the Indian children's book industry is bound to know Duckbill for the stellar books that they bring out. With protagonists who are feisty, self-aware, brave, sometimes downright goofy, but always adventurous and imaginative. Duckbill's books are known for their contemporary, sensitive, gutsy, and thought-provoking narratives. It is no surprise, therefore, that Duckbill books feature on practically every major list of award winners, including 4 times on the Neev Book Award winners list in 2018 and 2019, with the much-loved titles Tiger Boy, Queen of Ice, When GM Met Urmila, and Year of the Weeds. Welcome, Sayoni. We're thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you, Karthika, for the very, very kind words about Duckbill. That makes me very happy.
I'm sure that just like me, all the members of our audience cannot wait to listen to the two of you. So over to you, Emily and Sayoni.
Thank you so much. How lovely to be here. So I think we'll get started, Sayoni. Yeah. I can't actually see Sayoni, but I think that would be fine. So first of all, Sayoni, I wanted to ask, or talk about, what did we grow up reading during our childhood? And how the books that we read when we were children shaped us as adults? I've got loads of ideas, but you go first.
Well, I think given that we are pretty much the same age, we probably grew up reading pretty much the same things. What happened in India at that point in the 70s, when I was growing up, 70s and 80s, was that uh, most of us read in two languages, our mother tongues and English. And in English, while there was the National Book Trust and the Children's Book Trust, the selection of books was quite limited. So we read a lot of Enid Blyton, and we read a lot of Nancy Drew. We also read a lot of Russian folk tales. My early years involved reading a lot of Bengali books like by Leela Majumdar, Satyajit Ray, Shukumar Rai, and Bengali magazines. The difference, I think, between reading today and reading when I was growing up was that there were not very many teen books. So after a point, once one exhausted children's books, one automatically moved on to adult books. So I think that's the one very significant difference I find between my reading patterns and the reading patterns of children today. What were you reading when you were growing up?
I think that's so true about what you just said about moving straight onto adult. I went straight from my children's reading to reading Stephen King, and like really unsuitable books, actually, that probably traumatized me and made me the nervous wreck I am today. But I wanted to show you a couple of books I've because I'm at home, obviously, because we're on Zoom. I've got all my books around me, so it's quite exciting. I don't know if any of the audience have read this book, which is called Bookworm by Lucy Mangan, which is a history of her reading. She's also the same age as us, Sayoni, which I'm 50. I'm not. I think you might be a little bit younger than me, or maybe I don't know. But when I read this book, it made me reread some books that I read when I was a child, and one of them I reread was this book, and I guarantee no one's ever heard of this book in the audience. It's by Patricia Leach, For the Love of a Horse. And in this book, there's a girl who goes to the wilds of Scotland, and she trains a wild stallion that she finds out in the moors of Scotland. And but in this book, the boy that she really admires and likes is a vegetarian. And no one in my family is a vegetarian, and my family think I'm in the UK in 1980, no one really was a vegetarian. And I became a vegetarian. I always wondered why did I become a vegetarian, and why do I have some particular political views which are quite left-wing? And I realized it's all from this book. I've just copied this girl entirely. My whole life is this book. And I also think reading The Peppermint Pig, which maybe you did come across this book by Nina Borden, that's also very pro-vegetarian. That also made me a vegetarian. I also read, like you, a lot of Enid Blyton, and one of my favourites was The Magic Faraway Tree, also Mallory Towers. I think that really impacted on me, especially Mallory Towers, because I'm a working class girl from the London, but like you, I spend my life reading about people living in boarding school and wondering what that was like. And then another big book for me was the Little House on the Prairie, Little House books. Did you ever read those, Janie?
Yes.
Which completely inspired me, and it makes me just like love maple syrup to this day. I feel like I am me because of the books that I read, and it affected me so much. And I think it's just a fascinating thing to think about, how the books that children are reading now are making them, and who are they making them into.
So it's a slightly scary thought, actually.
Responsibility.
Well, yes, and also when one looks at the bestseller lists in India, we are going to have a lot of mice in the next generation. Geronimo Stilton is just huge.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Emily, for me, one of the joys of working in children's publishing, which I've been doing for many, many years now, is that over the last 10 or 15 years, there has been such a dramatic change in Indian children's books in terms of the kinds of writers, the kinds of themes being written about, the experimentation that's happening with form. So it's just children's publishing is a very exciting place to work in. Has it been like that in the UK as well? I mean, you have a much longer tradition of very exciting forms of writing in English than we do. I mean, we have a lot in different Indian languages, but English has been relatively staid.
Yes, I think things have really changed. As you were saying earlier, that teen books weren't really around when you were growing up. I think probably they were in America, weren't they? Because I pulled out a few books like Judy Blume.
Mhm.
Did you read American books? You
Yes.
know, so there wasn't the equivalent of teen books, and I think that in a way, I don't know if this is just a theory of mine, I don't know if you agree, but I think a big game changer was actually J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the
Oh, of
Chamber of
course.
Secrets,
Absolutely.
wasn't it? Because
Yes.
until that point, no one really took children's books very seriously. Well, they didn't,
Mhm.
you know, and then suddenly, wow, they can make a lot of money.
Mhm.
It felt like the landscape really changed. And I think in about 1999, I'm thinking about, is Jacqueline Wilson big in India? You
Jacqueline
aware of
Wilson, yeah, Jacqueline Wilson is well known, but she's, I suspect, better known to librarians than, I mean, she's definitely not a bestseller in any sense, but her
That's
books are
fascinating.
there. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, here in the UK, she is still a massive bestseller and she's published over 100 books. But I'm just thinking of her early books, which were thinking about diversity. They were very inclusive of class. I mean,
yeah.
in a way, just think of the books that we read. They were about posh people, basically.
Mhm.
You know, when we were growing up, that's what we read. But she started writing about this book, Dustbin Baby, and her book, The Illustrated Mum, single
Which I
parent,
love. Yes.
which is a brilliant book that
Yeah.
won the Guardian
Yeah.
prize in 1999. This book was published in 2000, I think. Dustbin Baby, yeah, about, you know, literally a baby found in the bin, and suddenly people who live in council flats are written about. That was a real game changer. I think Jacqueline Wilson's she's a really pioneering writer, and it's amazing how many books are still about people with quite privileged upbringings. And I think that she really changed things. And I was also thinking another big game changer was Melvin Burgess.
Yes.
Talking about teen books. So this is Junk,
Mhm.
and I know you read Doing It and were
And
amazed
Junk.
by that.
I just love Melvin Burgess.
He is an amazing writer. So
Yep.
absolutely brilliant. So yeah, suddenly drug addiction makes its appearance in a children's book. I mean, that was a very radical move, and it was heavily criticized. And there were lots of lots of radio interviews with people saying this is terrible, you're going to corrupt our children, and it's lots of anti Melvin Burgess. So I thought that was so interesting. And of course, I'm just sorry, I'm obsessed by books. I've got them all behind me. I think that Anne Fine is a very pioneering writer. Also, this is also happening about the 2000 time. Her book Flower Babies, also about boys. And then later, a big game changer in diversity sense is Mallory Blackman, obviously,
Yes.
Noughts and Crosses. This is actually the later, this is Noble Conflict, a later book. I don't know where my copy of Noughts and Crosses has gone, but that, if anyone hasn't read Noughts and Crosses or heard of it, please read it, because that's a really incredible book, isn't it, Sayoni?
Yes. It's fabulous.
And then I also thought about, I'm such a witterer about books,
please.
but I'm also I'm also thinking about David Almond is a very important author, I think, because he's one of the few authors that writes in a northern accent. I mean, I don't know if people know that in the UK we have a richer south and a poorer north, and lots of the publishing industry, or traditionally anyway, and the publishing industry has traditionally been in London, and many books are in a kind of southern accent, not like, for example, someone who lives in Newcastle, where David Almond's from, they will call their mum ma'am, like M-A-M, whereas I would call my mum living in London. And all books, it's always mum, never ma'am, but apart from David Almond. And that's his book Skellig. Is David Almond big in India?
Well, again, he's fairly, he's well known to librarians and, dedicated children's bookshops, but I'm not sure how well he's there in, like popular knowledge. Probably not very much.
Yes. Well, I'm fascinated to know more about how things work in India regarding books that you know, originally you were reading your Mallory Towers and your Enid Blyton. When did it change that you had your own children's books that everyone
But
reads?
there were always Indian children's books in English, which the National Book Trust and the Children's Book Trust was publishing from the 70s and 80s. Then in about 25 years ago, some very interesting developments happened. One was that in Chennai, almost simultaneously, 3 indie children's publishers began: Karadi Tales, Tara Books, and Tulika. And why all of them began around the same time and why in Chennai, I have no idea. They're all very strong women-led companies, and they produced very, very unusual, modern, and trailblazing books for the Indian market. In about 2000 or thereabouts, 2000, 2001, Penguin in India, in Delhi, restarted their Puffin imprint. That's when I started working in children's books, which again was, I mean, Penguin used to publish the occasional children's book, but it became, I suppose, the fact that Penguin then, as the biggest publisher, started a dedicated children's list, brought back Ladybird to India and things like that, kind of signaled a change in the more mainstream areas. So in India, the children's publishing has always been equally led by the indies and the bigger multinational publishing companies. However, for a fairly long time, a lot of the subjects written about were very gentle. There was a lot of mythology, there was a lot of folk tales. There was, unfortunately, a tendency to write fairly didactic books. Okay, I should also say here that I'm only talking about English books, because in Bengal, Maharashtra, Kerala, there are traditions of very, very wild and wacky and completely out of the box children's books, which English took a very long time to replicate. So a lot of the initial exciting publishing was happening with the indies, and was actually happening in the picture book area with people like Anushka Ravishankar writing just completely amazing and wonderful and wild books. It took a while for it to be accepted by schools, especially, that one could talk about certain subjects in children's books. For example, one of the first books which was written about kids who were gay was probably was this, Talking of Muskan by Himanjali Shankar, which I think was published in probably 2010 or thereabouts, 2014. So
Wow.
that's how recent that is. Again, and after that, there have been several, but it's a lot of the subjects talking about divorce, single parenting, mental health, talking about disability not as a sentimentalized thing, but as it's kind of fairly commonplace now. There has been a lot of books talking about disability in particular published across the spectrum, but there are still certain subjects which are not really talked about very much. For example, you know, in India, the conflict is less about race than about social class and caste. And that is something which still is almost never written about in children's books. One of the books we had published a while back, called Flat Track Bullies, talks about it. It's, I suppose, one of the first books to talk about social class, but again, and you know, the conflict that brings about. But again, it's still relatively very rare. And considering how omnipresent it is in our society and how much of a challenge it is in everyday life, it's quite strange. But I suppose
why do you think it happens? Why do you think it's not written about? Is it because no one's writing about it, or because publishers aren't publishing it, or?
I think it's quite a difficult subject to write about. The other thing is, I don't think children's publishers are fairly experimental as far as books go. especially because there's such a strong indie presence. But I suspect one of the things is that is perceived readership. So, for example, while a lot of kids would read English picture, we have 22 official languages in the country. So often the people who are reading for pleasure in English would tend to be very middle class, urban, living in the metros or the other larger cities. And therefore, a lot of people automatically write for this very middle class milieu because that is the readership. The other interesting fact, of course, is that because children's writing is really not a paying profession, and often the only people who can afford to do it are, very middle class women who do not have to depend on their writing for a living. That is a very unfortunate state of affairs, but that is how it is. It's practically a hobby.
Yes, that's the same in the UK. I mean, I think the average salary for an author is £12,000 a year, which is really not very much, believe me. Like, it's almost impossible to earn that much money in any other job, it's so low. But what do you think, what happened here in the UK is that everyone, I feel like even 5 years ago, the books were so white. It's just unbelievable, apart from Mallory Blackman and Noughts and Crosses. We in Book Trust, we did a survey of looking at children's books from 2007 to 2017. We've since done, we're going to talk about this a bit more later, but I just want to say, back 5 years ago, it was just less than 6% of the books that were published were by authors and illustrators of colour. And actually, the reason why people used to say, well, people used to think, oh, well, the audience is white and middle class, so the books are best to be white middle class, because if there's a black child on the cover, the book won't sell. And that was the thing, that you'd have, even 5 years ago, you'd have in bookshops, you'd have like you'd have a authors of colour section at the back of the bookshelf where a few books would be, and people would think that that if you were of colour you wouldn't buy the book or read the book. But then it's materialised in the last 5 years. Well, the reason was really because there weren't any, because everyone was white in books. It's actually tremendously off-putting not to see yourself in a book. Actually makes it less attractive to read a book if you don't see yourself in a book. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? If you don't provide books where people can see themselves, then it's always going to be a limited few people that want to spend their life in a British boarding school surrounded by white posh kids. There's always not going to be so many kids who want to do that. It's going to be really off-putting for them. That's why I feel so excited about what's happened in the UK in the last 5 years, how the numbers are starting to change, and how we're going to talk about great books that are inclusive and are diverse, and how I feel like it's a bit of an explosion going on in the UK at the moment. And also you see books like this book. I don't know if this author has come to you. I hope she has. Anjali Q. Ralph. Do you know of these books?
No.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is the boy in the back of the class.
Yeah, I do know this book. I've forgotten her name, but yeah.
She is an amazing author of colour. She is a Muslim author, I think, with Pakistani heritage, I think. I'm actually not sure. Anyway, this book is a massive bestseller here. In the bestseller charts, you have, it's all David Walliams here. David Walliams, David Walliams, J.K. Rowling, Jeff Kinney, and then Anjali is in the top 10.
That's so lovely to hear.
Humongous success, and she is the most amazing. Everyone has to read all Anjali Q. Ralph and must order these books straight away. She's written 3 books now. They're all brilliant, and oh my goodness, it just goes to show that if books are promoted and go in bookshops, then people will read them, and it will expand the audience basically. And there's a lot more kids out there that can be readers if the books aren't all about posh whiteys.
What you described about the back of the bookshop was where you'd find books featuring or books by authors of color made me smile, because for a long time I used to have this experiment that I'd walk into a bookshop and I'd identify the darkest, most obscure corner, and I'd go there and all the Indian children's books would be there. This is changing a lot, primarily thanks to some amazing independent bookshops, which are largely dedicated to children's books, and where the booksellers just curate and hand sell books, and they love books and they sell them really well. But it's still the case in chain stores. And I think that is one of the reasons that even now, when you look at the bestseller lists for children's books, it is very, very seldom that there is an Indian author on it, except for two Indian authors who have kind of, one is Ruskin Bond, who is lovely, but who has been writing the same kind of absolutely lovely, gentle book from about 1875. And the other is Sudha Murthy, who writes very inspirational stories which parents like. But often what this means is it's a very adult approved sense of what is a good book, which is being passed on to children, which I also find fascinating in social media reading groups, where you still have a lot of parents talking about how they want their children to read Enid Blyton and read mythology and read folktale. It's as if parents want children to not discover what is new in books, but to carry on the same tradition of reading that they themselves experienced. And yeah, we read Ruskin Bond in our childhood as well.
We have just the same problem here. It's identical here. Just today, there's been it's on Twitter now, it's a big storm on Twitter. This really famous footballer, Marcus Rashford, I don't know if anyone knows of him, but he's basically launching a book club. He's been involved in this free school meals debate that's been going on here.
That's
he
why
just
I know his name.
Yeah, you know him. He just tweeted out, or his people did, this list of 10 books to read, and it was truly hilarious. It included Wind in the Willows, literally a book from about 1810 or something. It's so sad that people still don't know about all these amazing books. And what you were saying about chain stores and supermarkets, that same thing's happened here. They'll often sell only about 20 books. You know, there'll just be 20 books on a stand, and they'll all be the same books everywhere you go. And of course, so many families, Book Trust, the charity that I work with, we're particularly interested in getting families from all backgrounds reading, because we know the massive benefit. If a child reads, they do better in life, better in education, from whatever class background they're from, whatever social economic background, they will do better if they read. So getting everyone reading is that's the central point of my charity. And I just think, I know that bookshops, beautiful independent bookshops, are often quite intimidating places for a family that doesn't count itself as a reading family. They will actually buy their books from a supermarket if they buy them at all. And then that limited palette that they get is a real problem. And it's actually really sad, because then you think, you know, I read so many books by authors from, you know, of all backgrounds, and I just think, if children get to read these books, that will actually expand and change their lives. That's why I'm so happy about books like The Boy at the Back of the Class by Anjali. It's actually a bestseller, and loads of kids read it. Every school will have it, and it's just so exciting to me.
You know, when I was, I think, high school or early years of college, Upamanyu Chatterjee's In English August was published. And that was really the first book I had read. And also because he's the protagonist in that is in his early 20s. But I remember staying up all night reading that book and thinking that the protagonist in this book is talking my language in a way I have never read before. And I think, you know, when I think about books that I would like to publish, I think I go back to that moment occasionally, because that's what you want children to find. You want a child to pick up a book and find that the characters are speaking her language.
Exactly, and to find themselves.
Yeah. And I think and I think that's happening. But I mean, there is just such a range of different kinds of voices which need to be heard and written about, that you know, while one would like to do it like in the course of 3 years. I think it's more like a 30-year project.
Of course, that's so true. I feel like in British publishing, I feel so excited about the way I mean, obviously people have talked about diversity, you know, since probably since about the 80s, 1980s. People have been talking about it in publishing and the UK publishing. But I feel like now something's changed, you know, something's different. It's to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and various political forces. Something's definitely changed. And I get loads of books sent to me to review and read. And I just notice there's more and more books that are so much more inclusive. It feels really exciting. And the research shows it's a slow and steady increase to the better. And of course, as you say, you know, if people started talking about things like this properly a couple of years ago, it actually does take more years than that. You know, it takes 18 months for a book to be published anyway, doesn't it? More or less, or more. And so it's bound to take longer to see the true glory of what's going to be happening. But I feel like it's just starting. I mean, you know, really, it's a golden age of children's books anyway. I mean, I just think children's books are just, when I compare it to the great but fairly limited books that I had to read when I was a kid, and now there's just everything to read. Sadly, there's so many other things to do as well, like play computer games, etc.
Which is lovely, because books have to become that much better to compete with them.
Yeah.
Should
exactly.
we quickly talk about the books that we wanted to in terms of the diversity scale and some of our...
I think there's a couple of slides, aren't there, that Karthika might put up. What's she going to start with? She's going to share. Yes.
Okay, so these were some of there are actually many, and I want to talk here about Pratham Storyweaver, which is just digital books which are freely accessible and copyleft, so anyone can translate them into any language that they like. Have you seen their books, Emily? Some of them are absolutely wonderful. You should just go to Storyweaver and have a look.
I will.
So there are some particular books that I just wanted to talk about here, which is, okay, I'll just go through the... Kneel on Wheels is by Lavanya Karthik, is about a little boy. There's been a lot of publishing in the last couple of years which have to do with children with disability. And Kneel on Wheels is about a little boy in a wheelchair, as is My Brother's Wheelchair by Salil Chaturvedi, which is a Pratham book. Then this book I wanted to bring up, Tiger, Tiger, Where Are You? By Mujahid Khan, which I found very interesting, because while there are lots of books about tigers, this was really an own voices book, because Mujahid Khan is a forest tiger guide. So it's very much written from the perspective of someone who lives with it. Friends Under the Summer Sun features a trans protagonist, and the subject is just dealt with so beautifully in a picture book for very young kids, which I thought was a complete achievement.
That's fascinating. I would love that book to be available in the UK, and I don't think it is.
Yeah. Vibhuti Cat by Shikandin is a book about a child who's on the Asperger's spectrum, on the autism spectrum, and again, very difficult, and he loves drawing cats, which is why it's full of cats. Then the book, which is partly covered here again by Lavanya Karthik, is Adil, which is about a boy who is hearing impaired. And I love the way that sign language is incorporated into the book. And the last book that I have recommended for younger readers is Snip, which is set in the Northeast. Now in India, sometimes it's said there's mainland India and then there are the Northeastern states. So there's this kind of tendency to really look at it as very different and very other. And one of the things that Pratham has done a lot is that they have a bunch of books which are very everyday stories set in the Northeast, which just takes away the otherness. So I think that's another thing which is very important in the Indian context, because we have such a very strong sense of regional culture and othering everyone who does not belong. And I think we need many more
Fascinating.
books like this. Kartika, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So middle grade and young adult, there's a lot of books happening which are about inclusiveness in different senses. What is interesting is that we don't actually, unlike picture books where you find a certain number of own voices books, it's relatively less in middle grade and young adult books. A lot of the stories are written by people who are actually working in specific areas. For example, Simply Nanju by Zainab Suleiman is set in a school for kids with special needs. And Zainab used to work in such a school. So it's a very, very intimate acquaintance with her subject. Year of the Weeds by Siddharth Sharma and Invisible People by Harsh Mandar, again, are both by people who have worked extensively with the communities which are being talked about, and that really comes across in the books. Unbroken by Nandika Nambi is a first book, and I can say it now, but when we read the book, we actually thought that Nandika herself was disabled. We subsequently found out that she wasn't. Slightly Burnt and Talking of Muskan are talking about homosexuality and kids coming to terms with that. And Manya Learns to Talk. Roar is about speech impediment. And yeah, so these are just some of them. And I think we should move on to yours because I suspect we're running out of time.
I don't know, the time's gone so quickly. This slide here, that was fascinating, Sayoni. Thank you so much. This slide here is actually something that we're doing this week, and anyone can go and follow this on Instagram. #PassThePen. All these books are illustrated or written by authors of colour in the last year, and they're all being promoted by established authors, like literary stars and like famous people on Instagram. They're being promoted this week. People are doing an Instagram takeover. So it's been really, really brilliant and really, really funny. So for example, there's a book, Mic Drop. I think the slide might have been slightly
Mic Drop's right in the middle.
Actually, I think it's got slightly. It's Mic Drop in the middle. Yes, sorry, yeah. Mic Drop is written by Shana Jackson, who wrote this. Absolutely, her first book was absolutely brilliant, and it's called High Rise Mystery, and it's all set in a council estate, but it's a detective novel. And actually, so many books previously that were published by authors of colour often ended up to be about rather gritty urban subjects, like basically harsh, hard lives kind of thing, which, some authors have felt slightly pressurised to write those kind of books. And some of them have been amazing. For example, Alex Wheatl's Little Bit, which won the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize, is one of the best books I've ever read in my life, and I'm obsessed by Alex Wheatle. I love those books. But but actually, it's been refreshing to have a detective genre book written by Black authors. Shana's the first to write a detective novel as a Black author in the children's author in the UK, and so that's been really amazing there. So we can go off that slide now if you like. This is just like if you go on to Pass the Pen, you will see all of these books. Just don't share slides for a second though. We'll just go back to our faces. Yeah. Osc actually, and then it won an award which I was a judge out on, which was called the Little Rebels Award. It was really a self-published book, and she probably couldn't get it published anywhere, but on winning that award, that's why I think awards are so important, and the changing the inclusion and diversity within awards in the UK is something that's really been changing as well. This book was picked up by Hachette and was now published, and I think it's doing really, really well. And that's just like one of the first times that we've read about family going to the mosque, a Muslim family, and being a very amusing, funny book, which has got great characters. That did not exist here until this book was published. So that's been a real trailblazer as well. I've got millions of books I can recommend. I could go on all day. What do you think awards matter in children's books, Janie?
Well, I do think they matter enormously, but I don't think that in India yet they affect sales. I think I think they work in terms of they make librarians aware of it. They make a certain small group of parents perhaps aware of it. But I can say that I mean over the last 8 years, Duckbill books have won a lot of the major awards available for children's books in India, and that has actually not helped sales at all.
Mm.
But it's still good because the authors are not earning very much money, so at least winning the award gives some motivation to carry on, because otherwise we might
Exactly, that's
all
true.
just pack our bags and well, we
That's
can't go
true.
home since we're all home anyway.
And
But yeah,
sometimes
I
the,
wish. Yeah,
sometimes
I
the
wish there
effect
was more
takes a while.
marketing. Yeah,
Yeah,
I wish that there was
but not.
more. Yeah, media attention. Librarians paid more heed to it, because otherwise it becomes slightly an exercise in futility. But I think your experience of what awards can do has been very different, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, for example, the book "The Boy in the Back of the Class" by Anjali Q. Ralph, that won the Blue Peter Book Award, which we also run. Blue Peter's is a very famous
Mhm.
show in the UK,
Mhm.
and that, I'm sure that would have impacted on her sales, and particularly I think the Waterstones Book Awards. The Waterstones is a very famous, massive bookshop and really amazing place that actually sponsors the laureate that I manage as well. And I think that there's a book, for example, well, actually, it was Look Up. This is a sequel, Clean Up, by this amazing illustrator Dapo Adiola, and this guy Nathan Bryan is the author. That also ended up. That was their first book, Look Up, and that ended up winning the Waterstones Book Prize, and that ended up going into the bestseller list as well. And I think Anjali's definitely had that experience. So I feel very excited about book awards, but yeah, they don't always translate into
Well, I suspect that, I mean, some of them, like the Neev Award, for example, is still relatively new. So hopefully, as it becomes, and Neev's done a lot of, has actually made a lot of attempts to make sure that the books are available for sale and things like that, which is a first for Indian Children's Book Awards, I think. But yeah, so I'm hoping that over time this will, just improve matters. And we have a Kartika with us.
Kartika.
Hello.
Hello.
I can't believe it's already time for us to start taking questions from the audience, because we could just listen to both of you go on and talk about books and talk about how wonderful children's literature has been for all of us. But we have some really great questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to start with a question from Asha Nemaya, who talks about the topic of diversity itself. Why do you think it's important for children to see themselves in books as characters who look, talk, and are like themselves? Is it not equally important for children to have the imagination and open mindedness to see that there are similarities that cut across class and ethnicity? Is it not as important for children to read about characters very different from themselves? What are your opinions on this?
Well, shall I start?
Yes, please.
I have got really strong opinions on this. Yes, I totally agree. Both. You need both. That's what you need. That's what's going to help. That's what's going to help a reader. Because yes, that's true. Reading Mallory Towers when I was a girl, that probably inspired me in some ways to go to university and educate myself, all these things, because I was a working class girl when no one went to university. I think reading those books about posh kids really affected me. And I know from the research that we did with authors and illustrators of colour, writing over the 2007 to 2017, so many of those authors said that they never saw themselves in a book. And so they were still readers. They were also reading Enid Blyton, but they never saw themselves in a book. And what it meant was they didn't see themselves as a writer. So it took many of our authors that are coming to prominence now many years to become a writer, because they didn't think, and I've got countless quotes on this subject, they didn't think that you could be an author if you were not white, writing about white things. And it's really sad. And I just think, so that's the thing, that if you read widely as as a child, you will be able to see yourself, and that will put yourself into context and make you feel good about yourself, but also read about others. And also, if you're white, in the UK, you don't want to only read about, if you're white and posh in the UK, you don't want to only read books about someone who's white and posh. Then you have this horrible little bubble where you're just this closed-minded person. You also need to read about, you need to, like, it's like books as mirrors and books as windows. You need the windows and you need the mirrors.
Thanks, Emily.
I agree completely. And Asha, I think children are capable of making the imaginative leap to identifying with kids who are different. But I think what books need is lots of different kinds of kids. And especially now, if one is publishing for the Indian market, the readership is so middle class and urban. And all these kids live in high-rise buildings in little bubbles, and they only interact with children like themselves. So there, I think it becomes even more important to have diversity in the books, because often that is the only way that children are going to encounter anything outside the world that they live in. And when I say, when we're talking about finding themselves in books, it doesn't always have to be social circumstance. It can also be an identification of spirit, I think, which can cut across class and other boundaries.
Yes, agree.
Thank you, Sayoni and Emily. We also have another question from Vijay Sharma, who's directed the question to you, Sayoni, but Emily, feel free to jump in after Sayoni responds. On the topic of books from India not talking about topics such as suicide or caste and class, or in quotes, serious topics, would one say that it is also because as a society and as families, we weren't too comfortable talking about such ideas at home? The idea of separation, of death, for example. That's her question.
It is absolutely that. And I am happy to say that it is, it's definitely changing. I mean, it's still handled carefully, but people are writing about it. For example, this book ends with a suicide attempt. This book begins with a suicide attempt. So it's happening. It's just not. You have to realize that we're also not publishing that many books every year, right? So there are, and if you look at a bigger publishing house, then a certain portion of their list will be taken up by very safe books such as Ruskin Bond. There will only be a certain number of books which are dedicated to what are still seen as high risk subjects. So I think within that framework, we're doing very well and making rapid gains. And of course, indie publishers often have lists which are entirely dedicated to unusual subjects. It's happening. But parents still don't want their kids to read these books. And schools do not want to have authors who write on these subjects visit. For example, when Talking of Muskan was published, we had done a session where a couple of school principals of very prominent Delhi schools were there, and they spoke out in support of the importance of having such books published. However, no school would invite Himanjali to come and talk about the book. So finally, we approached a couple of the principals who had been at the session and said that, since you like the idea, why don't you invite Himanjali to your school? And they said no. So there is still an enormous amount of resistance. There are still some parents and booksellers who will, embrace the books and promote them, but it'll take time.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can't please all the people all the time, can you? You're always going to, it's like language in books. If there is, it's how people define swear words, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Some swear words creep into a middle grade novel now, but not a really bad one. But people will be like, some librarians would, or some schools would have, or some parents would have those books banned. Any mention of homosexuality, ban the book. That's terrible. In America, books are always being banned, aren't they? There aren't that many books that are banned here. the banned book list. I mean, Melvin Burgess was definitely high on, everyone banned Melvin Burgess, didn't they? It's fascinating.
We had one book thrown out of a school library because in the dedication, the author referred to his wife as kick-ass. And they spent a lot of time explaining that no, that's a compliment. I know there's kick and there's ass, but it's actually put together, it's a good thing. But no.
That is hilarious. Oh my goodness.
Speaking of books and libraries, we incidentally have a response from a student from Neev who's read The Boy at the Back of the Class as a part of a novel study that his class did, and his teacher also, who says that the children really love this book. We thought that you might be happy to know that, Emily.
I'm
Teachers
so happy.
need
You must read her new book, which is called The Night Bus Hero, which is all about homelessness. And she always picks these heavy themes. She's an author. She also gives almost all her wages away. Like, she's the most charitable, incredible person. She is amazing, Anjali.
Lovely. I'm sure Dhruv and Miss Meera are very happy to hear that. We have a question from Meher Sohal. On the topic of bookstores, what is your opinion about the shift to online bookstores? Is this shift affecting reading habits, especially for children, specifically for children? I think in the context of the pandemic and people not being able to go to bookstores, do either of you have any thoughts on this?
I do.
Emily, would you like to go first?
I've got thoughts on everything. I think sorry. I think it's I love bookshops so much, and I think it is a problem. But in the pandemic, what can we do? We have to rely on online bookstores. In fact, in the UK, there's a new bookshop. It's called an online bookstore, which is going to
read about that.
Heard about
Yeah.
that? Bookshop.org. Which is actually supporting independent bookstores, and so I'm now buying all my online books from bookshop.org. So I think there are ways around it. Obviously, I mean, Amazon's amazing in some ways. Everyone uses Amazon, and people are buying books wherever people buy. If people buy books from somewhere, I'm kind of happy, but I would rather they buy them from a lovely independent bookstore than buy it from Amazon. But we actually, Book Trust, we have loads of recommended books on Amazon. We kind of work with Amazon to recommend books because we know people are going to be buying their books on there. They still need the recommendations. I think the worrying thing about on buying online books is you have to know what you're kind of looking for. So I think it perpetuates bestsellers, because they end up rising up in your list, don't they? And maybe the discovery factor, when you go into an independent bookstore, any bookstore, and then you see loads of books and you pick something up and go, oh, that looks interesting, and you can't do that.
I think some of the indie bookstores in India have done an amazing job in the lockdown. For example, there's a bookstore called Funky Rainbow, which every Saturday there is 1 hour session, which Vidya Mani does, where she introduces new Indian books to the audience. It's amazing. Her dedication every Saturday for the last God knows how many months she's been at it. And I think what she's doing is making sure that the discoverability factor is sustained. And a lot of the other indie bookshops are also doing very innovative things in terms of selling. But the sad fact is that people who buy from indie bookshops is kind of preaching to the converted. So those parents, had Vidya and others not done amazing things, would have probably gone away and found out by themselves. The number of people who are sticking to Enid Blyton and Geronimo Stilton is, I suspect, proportionately growing. But it's still a book.
Yeah, it's still a book.
Find themselves, yeah.
Exactly. And once you're reading, if you love reading anything, then you can love reading more. It's just if you're not reading at all. I mean, Book Trust, the charity that I work for, that's what we're all about, is getting books. We do universal giving with our Book Start program, giving to all babies that are born and all 5-year-olds that are born in the UK, which is amazing. And also in my Book Trust Represents project, we're going to schools and we give loads of books away, all by authors of colour, and we do amazing school visits. Many kids in the UK don't even have a single book in their house. So actually giving someone their first book is a massive thing.
That's a lovely thing.
On that note, I think we have time for one last question. We have a question from Helen Sharrock. Are there lists from Book Trust that would be available to inform future purchases for diversity in our collection? One. Also, are there sites, forums that you would recommend to keep updated on new publications in India and the UK?
There are definitely, on the Book Trust website, which is booktrust.org.uk, you will find multiple amazing lists of books. We have a great books guide that we publish every year, which has there's a PDF on the site. If you type in Book Trust Great Books Guide into Google, I can put the link on the chat after. That is 100 books and very inclusive titles, 100 books of this year. So that's a great list. And we've got loads of lists. We've got lists on everything in Book Trust. So yes.
We don't really have a list like that anymore in India. We used to have a new publications thing coming out, but I don't know, maybe follow Funky Rainbow. They do a very good job of promoting new Indian books.
Thank you, Emily and Sayoni. I think we have 2 minutes left. We have a comment from Paro Anand, who's a very eminent children's author, as is Ashan MI, who asked us the question earlier. Paro says, Sayoni, I think there is some very positive change happening. It is difficult all over the world and maybe more in India, but it is happening.
I agree. Absolutely,
Yes.
Paro. And Paro is one of the people who is really bringing the change around. I mean, the kinds of subjects that she writes about and the speed with which she writes about really difficult subjects is awe-inspiring. Emily, you have to read some of Paro's books.
You know, that's one thing I'm really taking from this conversation is I am just astonished. There are so many great authors that are writing about amazing topics. And why don't we know of them in the UK? You know, I want them to be published. I want them to be published in the UK. I want everyone to read these amazing books.
I think all of us will strive to make that happen.
Good.
Thank you so much for your time, Emily and Sayoni. It's been absolutely wonderful listening to both of you interact with each other. I'm sure our audience has had a really good time as well. We'll definitely follow up on all of these books that you've spoken about. We'll send it out as book lists to members of our audience. And if there's any further questions that we can take on books on book lists, we'll definitely share it with you at the end of the session for members of the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to stay on with us for the next session, we have a book club with Elizabeth Stewart on her young adult novel, Blue Gold. And we'll be right back with that in 1 minute. Thank you so much again, Sayoni and Emily. It was lovely having you.
Thank you, Karthika. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Sayoni. Thank you, Karthika. That was so fun.
Thanks.